This is my true story. I spent my whole life working so my son could have the life I never did. I gave him education, comfort, and a home built with my own hands. I thought when I grew old, he would give me the same love I once gave him. But one night, everything changed. He called me useless, said I was nothing but a burden. Then he kicked me out of the house I built for him. I left with nothing but pain. But I didn't stay broken. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. It started on a cold evening, one I will never forget. My son came home angry, slamming doors, shouting about things that didn't make sense. I stood there confused, watching the boy I raised become someone I didn't know anymore. He looked at me like I was a stranger in his house, like I didn't belong there. Then, out of nowhere, he said it. "You're useless." Those words hit harder than any slap. My heart felt heavy, but I stayed quiet. I thought maybe he didn't mean it. Maybe it was just anger. But he wasn't finished. He said I had done nothing for him, that I had only held him back, that my time was over. I looked around the room, the walls I painted myself, the furniture I bought with my sweat, the roof I built to keep him safe, and suddenly, it all felt foreign. It wasn't home anymore. He pointed to the door and told me to leave. My knees felt weak, my chest tight. I thought he was joking, but his face said otherwise. His wife stood there watching, arms crossed, saying nothing. Her silence hurt almost as much as his words. I wanted to ask, where should I go? But the pride in me stopped the question. I had been humiliated enough already. I picked up my old coat, the same one I wore to work for years, and walked toward the door. My hands shook as I reached for the handle. I looked back one last time, hoping to see a flicker of regret, but there was nothing, just cold eyes staring back at me like I was already gone. Outside, the air hit me hard. I didn't know where to go. I had no plan, no savings worth mentioning, no one to turn to. My wife had passed years ago, and all I had left in this world was the son I raised, the same son who now threw me away like trash. I sat down on the sidewalk in front of the house, watching the lights inside glow warm and bright. I could hear laughter coming from the living room, laughter that used to include me. My body shivered, but my heart burned hotter than ever. I stayed there for a while, hoping maybe he'd come out, maybe he'd realize what he'd done. But he never did. Hours later, I stood up and started walking. The night was quiet, except for the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. Every step felt heavier than the last. I thought about everything I'd done for him. The nights I stayed up fixing his school uniform, the years I worked 2 jobs so he could go to college, the times I skipped meals so he wouldn't have to. None of it mattered now. To him, I was nothing. Just a useless old man. The thought of that nearly broke me, but deep down, something else started to grow. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not hate, determination. By the time I reached the bus stop, I made myself a promise. I would not beg, I would not plead. I would not go back to that house again. He may have thrown me out with nothing, but I still had one thing left, my will to stand back up. I looked up at the night sky and whispered to myself, "You'll regret this one day." I didn't know how or when, but I knew life has a way of turning things around. That night I slept on a park bench. The cold bit through my clothes, but I didn't cry. I just stared at the stars and thought of all the times I carried him in my arms when he was a baby. I remembered his first steps, his first words, his first smile, and then I remembered his last words to me. "You're useless." That was the moment I decided that one day I would prove him wrong. Not with words, not with anger, but with success. I didn't speak to anyone for days. The silence around me became both a punishment and a teacher. The first night on that park bench was the hardest. I lay awake, staring at the dark sky, thinking about where everything went wrong. The same hands that once held my son when he was sick were now trembling from the cold. The same voice that once sang him lullabies was now silent because there was no one left to listen. I could still hear his words in my head. "You're useless." Every time I tried to sleep, they echoed again and again, cutting through my chest like a knife. I had never known that a few words could hurt worse than any wound. In the morning, people walked past me like I didn't exist. Some looked away. Some whispered. I was invisible. I walked through the streets with my old coat wrapped tight, trying to find work, but no one wanted to hire an old man. I used to be respected once. People called me sir, shook my hand, asked for advice. Now I was just another face in the crowd. I had no home, no family, no name that mattered. But through the silence, I began to think clearly for the first time in years. Maybe losing everything was how I would finally find myself again. One afternoon, I passed by a cafe where I used to take my son when he was little. He loved the chocolate cake there. I stood outside, watching other fathers laugh with their children, and something inside me cracked. I wanted to walk away, but my legs wouldn't move. I stayed there for hours, watching the kind of love I once had, the kind I lost. For the first time since that night, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. I didn't stop them. Sometimes pain needs to escape before you can start to heal. At night, I went back to the same bench. The silence became my only friend. No one asked where I had been, no one cared. But that silence began to teach me something important, that I didn't need anyone's permission to stand again. I started to think about all the skills I still had. I could fix things. I could repair broken lights, doors, plumbing. I wasn't useless. I just needed to prove it. Not to my son, but to myself. Days turned into weeks. I found small handyman jobs in the neighborhood, fixing doors, painting fences, cleaning yards. The pay was little, but it was honest. Every time I earned a few coins, I felt alive again. I saved every bit I could, not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted purpose. Each coin I earned was a reminder that my son was wrong. I wasn't useless. I was rebuilding, one small job at a time. There were nights I still thought of him, wondered if he ever felt guilty, if he ever thought about me. But I didn't call. I didn't visit. I had nothing left to say. Silence became my armor. I knew if I spoke too soon, my anger would take over, and I didn't want that. I wanted control. I wanted to earn my revenge through success, not through bitterness. Sometimes, I'd walk past his neighborhood late at night, just to see the house I once built. I'd look from a distance, the lights shining bright through the windows, laughter spilling out, my grandson's shadow running across the curtains. They didn't even know I was there. I stood outside like a ghost, watching the life that used to be mine. It hurt, but it also fueled me. I told myself that one day he would look at me again, but this time he wouldn't see weakness. He would see power. The silence that once felt like death slowly turned into strength. Every day I worked quietly, saved quietly, and planned quietly. People say silence is empty, but they're wrong. Sometimes silence is where a broken man rebuilds his soul. And as I stood in that quiet, forgotten by the world, I started to understand something. Maybe being thrown away was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because from that moment on, I didn't live to earn my son's respect anymore. I lived to earn my own. The days that followed were long and heavy. Every morning I woke before sunrise, washed my face in a public restroom, and went out looking for work. Sometimes I got lucky. Someone needed a pipe fixed or a wall painted, but most days ended with nothing. I ate one meal a day, usually bread and tea. My body was tired, my hands rough and cracked, but my mind refused to give up. The world had called me useless, but I swore I would prove otherwise. I didn't care how long it took or how hard it became. I was ready to crawl through the pain if that's what it took to stand again. People didn't see me the way they used to. To them, I was just another old man trying to make ends meet. They didn't know that years ago, I was the one who paid for others' meals, who gave advice to younger men, who carried entire projects on my shoulders. Now, I was invisible. But sometimes being invisible is a blessing. No one expects anything from you, and that gives you freedom. I didn't owe anyone anything anymore, not even my son. For the first time in my life, I was working only for myself. One afternoon, as I was walking home from a small plumbing job, it started to rain. I had no umbrella, so I just kept walking. The rain soaked through my clothes, the wind bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I looked up at the gray sky and whispered, "You can't break me." That was the first time I said it out loud. It felt strange, but also powerful. Every drop that hit me reminded me of that night my son threw me out, and I realized something. Pain only controls you when you run from it. I decided to face it, to walk through it, to let it make me stronger. At night, in the small room I rented, I would sit by the window and write in an old notebook. I wrote down everything I felt, every insult, every failure, every dream I refused to let die. I didn't know why I did it then, but looking back, I think I needed proof that I was still alive, that I still had something left to give. Sometimes I'd fall asleep mid-sentence, the pen still in my hand, the pages wet with tears I didn't even realize had fallen. The struggle changed me. It stripped me of pride, but it gave me purpose. I learned to live with less, to value every small victory. When someone handed me a few coins, I smiled and said thank you like it was a fortune. When I finished a hard job and the client nodded in approval, I felt rich. Slowly, quietly, I started to build something out of nothing. It wasn't easy. There were nights I wanted to give up, nights I thought maybe my son was right. But then I'd remember all the times I carried him on my shoulders when he was little, how I never let him fall. And that memory reminded me that I was never useless. I was just forgotten. I started learning new things. I asked questions, watched others work, studied how businesses ran. I didn't have a college degree, but I had something more valuable: experience. I knew how to fix problems, how to lead, how to survive. And slowly, people began to notice. One man I helped with a house repair introduced me to his friend who owned a small warehouse. They needed someone to handle maintenance, inventory, and deliveries. I took the job without hesitation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a chance, and that's all I needed. I worked harder than anyone else. I showed up early, stayed late, never complained. Within months, they trusted me with more responsibility. I managed orders, trained new workers, handled clients. The same people who once ignored me now respected me. Every night, I went home tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from building something with your own hands. The struggle didn't destroy me. It built me from the ground up. I learned that when life takes everything away, it's giving you a clean slate to rebuild something better. I was still poor, still alone, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel worthless. I was becoming someone again, slowly, quietly, painfully, but surely. Sometimes when the nights grew too quiet, my mind would drift back to the past. The memories came uninvited, soft at first, then sharp, cutting deep like fresh wounds. I would see my son as a little boy again, running barefoot through the yard, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. I could almost feel his tiny hands holding mine, tugging me toward the ice cream cart. Back then, all he wanted was my attention, my love, and I gave it. Every bit of it. I worked extra hours just to buy him toys, skipped meals so he could eat better, stayed up late fixing things he broke just so he could smile again. Those moments were my life. I lived for him. I never thought a day would come when that same child would look at me and see a burden. I remembered the nights I'd come home exhausted from work, dirt under my nails, grease on my hands. He would run to the door and hug my legs, shouting, "Dad's home." That sound used to heal everything. The tiredness, the pain, the hunger. I'd look at his face and think, it's all worth it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every coin I earned went into his future. I didn't want him to struggle like I did. I didn't care if I went hungry as long as he was fed. That was my only dream, to make sure his life was better than mine. Now, as I sat alone in that tiny room, those memories were both comfort and torture. Comfort because they reminded me that I had once been loved. Torture because they showed me how far we had fallen from that love. I couldn't stop asking myself, where did I go wrong? Was I too soft? Did I give him too much? Maybe I should have taught him the value of pain, the strength that comes from earning, not receiving. I raised him to live easy, not realizing that comfort can make a person forget compassion. Sometimes I'd look at the old photograph I kept folded in my wallet. It was faded now, edges torn, but the image was still clear. Me and him, side by side, smiling in front of the house I built. That smile used to give me strength. Now it just reminded me that love can vanish faster than money ever could. I wondered if he still remembered the man who carried him on his shoulders through the rain, who stayed up nights when he was sick, who stood in school lines to pay his fees. Or did he only remember the day he decided I was too old, too poor, too useless to be part of his perfect life? There were nights I wanted to hate him. I really did. But every time anger rose in my chest, it melted into sadness. He was still my son, my blood, my own flesh. I couldn't hate him, but I couldn't forgive him yet either. Forgiveness felt too much like letting him win, and I wasn't ready for that. So I held on to the memories, not to feel sorry for myself, but to remember why I needed to rise again. I wanted to prove that love betrayed can still stand taller than cruelty given. Each time I thought about those old days, I worked harder the next morning. I reminded myself that the man I used to be, the father who sacrificed everything, was still inside me somewhere. He just needed a reason to come back. Every memory of laughter became fuel. Every memory of kindness became fire. I told myself that one day my son would see me again, not as a weak old man, not as a burden, but as someone he could never break. The past hurt, but it also guided me. It showed me that love alone isn't enough. Respect must follow. I had loved my son too much to make him strong. But now life was giving me another chance, a chance to become the man he could never destroy. I stopped being haunted by what I lost and started being driven by what I could still become. And as I stared at that photo one last time before tucking it away, I whispered to myself, "You'll see me again, son. But when you do, you won't recognize the man you once threw away." It happened on an ordinary day, one of those long afternoons where I was working under the summer sun, fixing an air conditioner for an office building. My hands were tired, my back aching, but I was used to it by then. Work had become my only escape. As I stood on the ladder tightening a bolt, I overheard two men talking inside the office. Their voices carried through the open window. They were discussing how the company was struggling, how it might be sold soon, and how the new investors were looking for opportunities to buy it cheap. I didn't think much of it at first, but when one of them mentioned the company's name, my hands froze. It was the same company where my son worked, the same place he bragged about, the same place he said he'd make something of himself. For a long moment, I just stood there, silent, listening. My heart started to beat faster. I thought about walking away, pretending I hadn't heard anything, but something inside me refused to move. I realized life had just given me a chance. One small door opening in the middle of years of closed ones. I finished the job quietly, collected my pay, and went home. But my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know how, but I was going to find a way to buy into that company. Not for revenge, at least that's what I told myself, but to take back my dignity. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the window, looking out at the empty street, thinking about all the years I had wasted begging for respect from people who never valued me. I thought about my son's words, about being useless. I whispered to myself, "We'll see who's useless." I had no business degree, no fancy education, but I had experience, patience, and the kind of hunger only pain can create. That's when I decided I wouldn't just survive anymore, I would rise. The next morning I went to the bank. I didn't have much savings, but I had enough to start something small. I took out a loan, the kind that could ruin me if I failed. Then I reached out to an old friend, a man I once helped when he was starting his own logistics business. He hadn't forgotten. When I told him my idea, he didn't laugh. He looked at me and said, "If anyone can do this, it's you." He introduced me to a few people, small investors who were looking for opportunities. With their help, I started buying shares of that company quietly, little by little, through different channels. No one knew my name. I was just another silent investor. Each month, I bought more. Each time, I reminded myself why I was doing it. I wasn't chasing money. I was chasing respect. The same company my son was proud of slowly became mine piece by piece, and I didn't tell a soul. I worked harder than ever, saving every extra dollar to buy more stock. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, paperwork, long nights of doubt. But the more I struggled, the stronger I became. Every signature I signed felt like a small piece of my soul returning to me. 1 year later, I sat across from the company's board members as they discussed the final sale. They didn't recognize me. To them, I was just an older man representing a new investment group. They talked about numbers, contracts, and shares. I said very little. When the deal closed, one of them smiled and said, "Congratulations, sir. You now own majority control." I nodded quietly, but inside, I felt something powerful. Not pride, but peace. The same world that had once thrown me away now bowed to my decisions. As I walked out of that building, the sunlight hit my face, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I had done it. I had built myself back from the ground with no help, no handouts, no pity. And the irony of it all was that my son worked for me now, without even knowing it. The thought made me smile, not out of revenge, but out of justice. Life had finally turned around, and it had done it quietly, without me needing to shout or beg. I went home that night and looked at the old photograph of me and him again. I didn't feel pain anymore. I just whispered, "I told you I'd stand again." After that day, something inside me changed forever. I wasn't the broken father who slept on benches anymore. I was a man with a plan, a man who had clawed his way back from nothing and now held the quiet power to decide what happened next. I didn't want revenge made of shouting or anger. I wanted something colder, quieter, and lasting. I wanted my son to face the truth, that the man he called useless had become everything he once dreamed of being. But I wouldn't go to him. I would let him come to me, unaware, standing in front of the same man he had thrown away. That was my plan. I spent weeks studying every detail about the company. I learned who managed which department, who made decisions, how much my son earned, and where his position stood in the company. He was still there, working proudly, still thinking he was climbing up the ladder. I could almost imagine him bragging to his friends about the promotions he thought were coming. The irony made me smile. He had no idea that every step he took inside that company was now under my control. The same man he humiliated was now the one signing his paycheck. But I didn't act right away. I wanted to understand the company completely before showing my face. I visited the office quietly one morning, pretending to be a maintenance inspector. I walked through the hallways slowly, watching the employees, listening to the rhythm of the place. When I passed by his department, I saw him through the glass wall, confident, loud, arrogant. He was giving orders, not realizing he was standing in a building owned by the man he'd thrown out of his home. For a moment, I just watched him. It was strange. I felt proud and heartbroken at the same time. Proud because I had raised him strong. Heartbroken because I had raised him cruel. That day, I made a final decision. I would keep my ownership quiet for now. I would run the company from the shadows, build it stronger, expand it, and wait until the right moment to reveal myself. I wanted the impact to be so powerful that it would freeze him where he stood. Not to humiliate him, but to make him understand. Some lessons need to be written not in words, but in life itself. I started changing the structure of the company slowly. Better systems, fairer pay, opportunities for workers who were ignored. People began to talk about the mysterious new owner who actually cared about his employees. Profits rose, morale lifted, and the business started thriving. The same company that had been sinking under old leadership now became one of the most respected firms in the region. My team didn't know who I really was, but they trusted my guidance. Every improvement, every success was another quiet victory, proof that I was never useless. At night, when I went home, I would sit by the window and think about how far I had come. The road had been long, filled with shame, hunger, and pain. But the destination was worth every step. I often wondered how my son would react when he found out. Would he feel regret? Would he understand what he'd lost? Or would his pride still blind him? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. When that moment came, I would look him in the eye, not with hate, but with calm. Because nothing punishes arrogance more than humility returning stronger. I continued growing the company, meeting with investors, signing deals, and building trust. Every decision I made was careful, deliberate, and quiet. I didn't want fame. I didn't want attention. I wanted peace, the kind that only comes when life restores what was taken from you. 2 years after that day on the park bench, I had rebuilt my life entirely. I owned the company. I had my own home again. My name, once forgotten, was whispered in boardrooms with respect. And my son? He was still there, sitting at a desk in my building, working for me, completely unaware. The plan was almost complete. All that was left now was the reveal. Months passed, and everything began to move in my favor. The company grew stronger under my direction, but I stayed hidden behind layers of management and paperwork. I didn't need people to see my face yet. I wanted them to feel my presence through change. The workers who were once ignored now smiled when they walked in. Bonuses were given. Old debts were cleared. Departments that had been neglected were reorganized. The company that was dying when I first bought it now breathed again, alive, steady, and full of life. And in the middle of it all, there was my son. He still walked through those hallways with that same pride in his step. He had no clue whose name was now signed at the bottom of his paycheck. He talked about the new owner sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with frustration. I heard from my managers that he complained about new policies and stricter work expectations. He said the company had changed, and he was right. It had. But he didn't realize who changed it. I watched him from afar, through reports, through updates. I learned about his habits, his work ethic, his mistakes. I didn't spy on him out of anger. I just wanted to see what kind of man he had become. Sadly, nothing had changed. He still took credit for others' work. He still talked down to those beneath him. He still acted like the world owed him something. The arrogance was still there, growing like a shadow that had never left. One day, I visited the office under a different pretense, a routine check-in disguised as part of the investor group. When I stepped inside the building, no one recognized me. I wore a suit this time, clean and pressed. My shoes were polished, my hair cut, my face calm. I was no longer the old man who once begged for a roof. I was the owner, though no one knew it yet. As I walked past the reception, I heard my son's voice from down the hall. He was speaking loudly, telling someone to do it right for once. His tone was the same as it had been that night when he yelled at me. It was strange how arrogance sounded exactly the same, no matter how much time passed. I stopped for a second, listening. Not because I wanted to, but because part of me still couldn't believe how cold he had become. He came out of his office, papers in his hand, and brushed past me without even looking. He didn't recognize me. My hair had turned completely gray, my face lined deeper, and I carried myself differently now, quietly, confidently. He was too busy on his phone, talking about deadlines, complaining about management decisions. For a moment, I almost laughed. My son, angry about decisions made by me. It was poetic. When I reached the top floor, my managers greeted me with respect. They knew me as Mr. Gray, one of the main silent investors. I reviewed financial reports, discussed expansion plans, and approved new partnerships. I listened as they talked about my son, how talented he was, but also how careless and arrogant. I said nothing. I just nodded and told them to keep him where he was. Not higher, not lower, not yet. I wasn't ready to face him, not until the time was right. Each evening, when I went home, I'd think about that moment. The day he'd finally realize who owned the company. I didn't want it to be a dramatic confrontation. I wanted it to be quiet, undeniable, and unforgettable. I wanted him to feel what I once felt, the kind of silence that crushes you from the inside because you know there's no way to fix what you've done. Slowly, rumors began to spread through the company about a new restructuring, about the owner finally visiting. The employees were excited. They said he was kind but firm, fair but powerful. My son laughed about it, saying, "If he's that good, maybe I should meet him." I smiled when I heard that. He had no idea that the man he was mocking was the same man he once threw into the streets. The shift wasn't just in the company, it was in me. I had gone from powerless to powerful, from forgotten to feared, from rejected to respected. And the best part was that I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to raise my voice or seek apology. Life had already done the work for me. All I had to do was show up, at the right time, in the right way, and let the truth do the rest. The day finally came. I had been waiting for it for 2 long years. The company sent out an email to all staff announcing that the new owner would be visiting for an official introduction and leadership meeting. I knew he would be there, sitting somewhere in that conference room, surrounded by his co-workers, full of confidence, maybe even trying to impress whoever this mysterious owner was. He had no idea it was me. The same father he once threw out of his house, the same useless man he mocked. I woke up early that morning, the sky still gray outside. As I got dressed, I looked at myself in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't the same one who had slept on park benches or eaten scraps to survive. This man was sharper, calmer, stronger. The pain had aged me, but it had also shaped me. My suit fit perfectly, my shoes polished. There was no sign of weakness left. For the first time, I didn't feel like a father about to face his son. I felt like a man about to face justice. When I arrived at the office, the atmosphere was buzzing. Everyone was whispering, curious about who the new boss was. Some stood straighter, others adjusted their ties, and I could feel the nervous energy in the air. My assistant guided me to the elevator, and as the doors closed, I took a deep breath. I had waited for this moment through sleepless nights, empty stomachs, and tears no one saw. I wasn't sure if I would feel anger or peace when I saw him again. But I knew one thing. I was ready. When the elevator opened, the boardroom was already full. Dozens of employees sat around a long glass table, their eyes turning toward me as I stepped inside. The room fell silent. I could see faces I didn't know, people I had never met. But then, my eyes found him. He was sitting halfway down the table, leaning back casually, confident as always. He didn't recognize me right away. He was too busy scrolling on his phone, smirking, whispering something to the coworker beside him. I walked slowly to the front of the room, each step echoing in the silence. And then, as I turned to face everyone, I saw the exact moment it hit him. His phone dropped onto the table. His face went pale. His eyes widened. The color drained from him completely. I greeted everyone politely, introducing myself as the new majority owner. My voice was steady, calm. I thanked them for their work, spoke about the company's growth, about the future. My son didn't move. He just sat there, frozen, staring at me like he was looking at a ghost. Every few seconds, I could see his throat tighten, his eyes dart around the room, unsure if this was real. When the introductions ended, I paused and looked directly at him. The whole room seemed to vanish. It was just him and me now. I held his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see the boy I raised. I saw the man who had thrown me away. I didn't hate him. I just saw the truth. The arrogance, the pride, the emptiness. Everything he had become. He tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper, trembling. But before he could say anything, I simply said, "Good to see you again." The words were calm, but I saw them hit him like a brick. He blinked rapidly, trying to find words, but there were none. Every face in that room turned to look at him. He looked smaller now, not in size, but in spirit. The man who once stood tall over me now looked like a frightened child. I continued the meeting, outlining future plans, assigning new department heads, talking about growth strategies. My tone never changed. I didn't raise my voice or look at him again. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. By the time the meeting ended, his hands were shaking. As I walked toward the door, I stopped beside his chair for just a moment. I didn't say anything. I just placed my hand on his shoulder, a quiet reminder of who I was and what he had lost. And then I walked out, calm, composed, free. That moment, seeing him crumble in silence while I stood tall, was not revenge. It was closure. Life had finished what I couldn't. The same son who once threw me out of his home now sat inside my company, speechless, realizing too late that the man he had called useless had become the one thing he could never be: unstoppable. After the meeting ended, the room emptied quickly. Everyone whispered on their way out, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. My son stayed seated, frozen, like his body had forgotten how to move. I stood near the window for a moment, watching the city below, the same city that once ignored me, the same streets I had walked when I had nowhere to go. And now I stood above it all, not because I wanted power, but because I earned peace. When I turned around, he was still sitting there, his hands clasped tightly together, his breathing shallow. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. No words, no noise, just silence. The same kind that used to haunt me when I lay on that cold park bench years ago. Except now, the silence didn't belong to me. It belonged to him. He was drowning in it, just like I once did. Finally, he stood up. I could see his lips trembling. He took one hesitant step forward, then stopped. "Dad," he whispered. His voice cracked. It wasn't the voice of a proud man anymore. It was small, broken, uncertain. The word "dad" came out like it hurt him to say it. I didn't move. I wanted him to feel that space between us, the years, the distance, the choices. He had built that gap brick by brick, and now he had to live inside it. He started talking fast, apologizing, saying he didn't know, that he was sorry for what happened. His voice stumbled through excuses and regret. But I didn't say a word. I let him talk, just like I had once let him yell at me when he called me useless. The difference now was that I wasn't broken anymore. I was calm, strong, untouchable. Every word he said bounced off the armor that pain had built around my heart. When he finally stopped talking, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I took a deep breath, walked closer, and looked him in the eyes. "You said I was useless," I said quietly. His face flinched. I continued. "You looked me in the eye, in my own home, and told me to leave. You made me believe I was nothing." His eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? I lost everything. I slept on benches, worked in the rain, went hungry, all because of you. But I didn't die. I didn't beg. I built myself again, piece by piece. And now," I paused, my voice steady, "now I own everything you thought I'd never have." He couldn't look at me. His shoulders shook as he whispered, "I was wrong." But the damage was already done. The apology came too late, and I had no need for it anymore. I didn't want revenge. I wanted realization, and I saw it in his eyes. He finally understood the weight of his cruelty. He understood what it means to destroy someone who once gave you everything. I walked past him and stopped at the door. "You work here now," I said, my voice calm. "So, you'll follow the same rules as everyone else. No special treatment, no shortcuts. And if you want to stay, you'll start from the bottom. Cleaning staff." His head shot up, disbelief on his face. "Start from where I did," I said. "Let's see how useless that feels." He didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, his face pale, tears dripping down. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. The pride that once filled his chest was gone. He had built his success on my suffering, and now he'd have to rebuild his humility from the ground up. As I walked out, I didn't feel joy or triumph. I felt peace, the kind of peace that comes when the world finally balances itself. I didn't destroy him. I let life do that. All I did was survive long enough to see it happen. He once stood over me, proud and powerful, while I sat in the cold. Now the roles had reversed. He stood small, quiet, and broken, while I walked away tall, not because I won, but because I endured. And in the end, endurance is the greatest victory a father can have over a son who forgot where he came from. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes in silence, in calm faces, in small moments when truth stands taller than pride. That's what I felt in the days that followed. I didn't shout. I didn't boast. I didn't tell anyone what he had done to me years ago. I just let time reveal everything on its own. The employees noticed how different he became. The same man who used to walk through the office with arrogance now kept his head down, doing his work quietly. The one who once looked down on others was now wiping tables, taking orders, answering to the people he used to ignore. It wasn't punishment, it was balance. Each morning when I arrived at the office, I would see him cleaning the hallways. He never looked up, but I knew he could feel my presence. Sometimes I stopped for a few seconds, watching him, remembering how things used to be. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was a strange sadness. This was my son. The boy I once carried on my shoulders, the child I once worked all night for. I gave him everything so he could have a good life, and in return, he gave me shame. Yet now, seeing him there, humbled and quiet, I realized something. Sometimes life teaches lessons that words never can. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the distance between us began to soften. He started greeting me quietly in the mornings. He didn't expect forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But there was understanding, unspoken, fragile, but real. I could see it in the way he carried himself now. The pride was gone, replaced by remorse. The arrogance had turned into reflection. He had learned more in those few months of cleaning floors than in all the years of comfort I once gave him. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I saw him sitting alone on the stairs outside. His clothes were dirty, his hands rough from work, but his eyes, they were different now. Not angry, not proud, just tired and maybe grateful. I didn't say anything, I just nodded. He nodded back. That small gesture meant more than any apology. It was his way of saying, I understand. After that, I asked HR to move him to a different department. Not as a manager, not as anything special, just a regular position where he could start again. He didn't know I made that decision, and I didn't tell him. I didn't need to. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge or power. It's about giving someone the chance to rebuild what they destroyed, piece by piece, the hard way. Months later, when the company celebrated its anniversary, I stood on the stage and gave a speech. I spoke about struggle, about respect, about never forgetting where you came from. I didn't mention names, but everyone knew what I meant. My son was sitting in the back of the hall. When our eyes met, he looked down, ashamed but listening. Maybe that was enough. Justice had already been served long before that night. It wasn't in money, or power, or control. It was in the quiet realization that he finally understood the pain he once caused. He learned what it felt like to be small, to be ignored, to be powerless. And he learned that the man he once called useless had built something no one could take away: dignity. Now when I go home, I don't think about the past with anger anymore. I think about how far I've come. From sleeping on a bench to owning the building my son now works in. From being called worthless to being called sir. That's justice, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that restores. He used to laugh at me for being poor. Now, he works for me. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I wanted him to understand. Respect isn't given. It's earned. And sometimes the people who seem the weakest are the ones who rise the highest. That's the lesson life gave him. That's the justice life gave me.